and you're very welcome to another episode of History Now. Joining me on today's show from California is Native American activist, educator and filmmaker, Mr. Jim Warne. Jim is here to talk to us about his recent documentary, Seventh Generation, an award-winning documentary which looks at the history and current plight of the Lakota Nation in the Americas. So Jim, you're very welcome to History Now. It's a real honor for me to speak to you today. Now, the documentary, Seventh Generation, I've watched it a couple of times now, and it's fascinating. It's a very inspiring story, but also one that deals with tragedy. Could you tell us a bit about why you made the documentary and a bit about the title, Seventh Generation? Could you tell us what the meaning is behind that?
Well, first of all, Palamia, thank you so much for having me and allowing me to share my story and perspectives of history and our perspectives as Indigenous people in the Americas. As stated, my name is Jim Warne. Tushunka Okanwachakte is my Lakota name. And seventh generation is a philosophy that I was taught from when I was very young. So this movie, at the end of the film, you'll see that I honor my mother, my Ina, Beverly Stabber Warne. And she obviously raised my brother and I in urban America, off the reservation, if you will, in Phoenix, Arizona, where I grew up. So I didn't grow up around my tribe, but I did grow up around other tribes. And mom and dad made sure that every year we went home once or twice a year so that we would know our Lakota culture, so that we would not forget who we are. Many times there's a term called urban Indian in America, where it's referring to Native people that live in non-Indian communities and urban communities. So I'm an urban Indian living in San Diego, California. But my homelands is now, as a result of American contact, is Pine Ridge. So that's my homelands, I call it. Pahasapa, the Black Hills, is our spiritual lands that the film addresses. So seventh generation is a philosophy as a Lakota that we learn that we represent our ancestors 7 generations behind, as well as 7 generations ahead. So that's quite a responsibility culturally, when you think that you must represent your people in a good way 7 generations ago, which is Wounded Knee. So that's why it was a timely time to make the film, because it was just the 130-year anniversary of Wounded Knee. So again, when you think of the time frame and then the pendulum, if you will, to the future generations, we're doing things now to leave footprints that will represent them in a good way. And so it's quite a responsibility. There's a term saying it's hard to be Lakota or hard to be Native here in America, but it's because that we have to juggle between 2 cultures, the American culture as well as our traditional culture. So this film was made in honor of Wounded Knee families and people that were killed that day, because we are now in the 7th generation of Wounded Knee. So all of us are somebody's 7th generation. So each generation that comes forward, you know, they are going to represent another generation ahead of me when I make my ultimate journey to be with the ancestors. So that's kind of a quick explanation of 7th generation philosophy. And that Black Elk had that saying that it would take 7 generations to heal our circle after Wounded Knee Massacre. So that's something that I thought would be timely. This is a lecture I've been doing for many years academically as a teacher and professor, but I got an opportunity to transform my lecture into a film, and fortunately it's been able to get out to the public and we can share our story from our perspective.
Of course, as you mentioned, Wounded Knee, the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. We're perhaps over here familiar with the name, but not so much of what went on. And I think traditionally people have wrongly said that it was the Battle of Wounded Knee, whereas in actual fact it was a massacre. It wasn't a straight fight, as it were. It's very important to the story that you're telling. So could you give us a bit of background of what happened at Wounded Knee in December 1890?
Yeah, that's obviously a significant time for us when we think of what happened 130 years ago. And Wounded Knee was a significant event in terms of we had to make a decision in terms of our people, our culture, our ways. How are we going to survive this invasion by this force that is killing us at a high rate? So Wounded Knee, as a result of the ghost dance and some of the things that were happening during that time, and the hostile, savage things that they used to call us, that was part of their justification of killing women and children and elders, because Chief Bigfoot was trying to flee to Canada for safety to get away from American persecution. But unfortunately, he was caught and was marched back to what is now Wounded Knee. And then unfortunately, the horrible massacre happened. And my family is number 18 on the list of families on the headstone of that mass grave. So I often share when I teach here in the Americas that many and most American citizens do not have the experience of visiting family members in a mass grave. So there are many mass graves out there that are lost in history, but at least we have that site where we can make sure they're never forgotten. And it's a point of history similar to the Holocaust in Europe, where they have, concentration camps as museums so that it shares that horrible history so that it doesn't happen again. Wounded Knee is something similar in terms of a grave site that we must maintain so that that point in history never happens again. And obviously I don't want my family and 7 generations ago to be forgotten, because then the preference is to call it a battle. So therefore we don't have to address the issue of massacre. And the 7th Cavalry was the ones that did those horrible acts at Wounded Knee. And they were obviously the remnants of what General Custer was with the 7th Cavalry. So Greasy Grass is what we call it. Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand, is what America calls it. But that was the 7th Cavalry. So they were really eager to get to us. And even though we weren't armed and it was mostly women and children, they were very willing to kill those families that day. So it's a historical event that should never be forgotten. And that's something in history. I heard it called that, history, tells the kind of the dirty side of the facts. Commemoration is more of a political celebration. And when they say Wounded Knee Battle, they're trying to commemorate something that was not the truth. So fortunately, we have an opportunity to tell the truth through film, and there's more of us in academia, and the truth is starting to get out there, and that's part of the 7th generation philosophy.
And as I mentioned there, and you mentioned, Jim, that what we traditionally perhaps knew as the Battle of Wounded Knee was, of course, a massacre. And that leads on to, wider themes in terms of history. And you make the point in the documentary that there is a level of historical ignorance in the United States today about how the United States was born and the impact that had on Native people. Of course, America, United States of America, is not unique in that regard. There's historical ignorance everywhere. But could you tell us what you see is the historical ignorance in terms of the birth of the United States and its impact on Native people, how that impacts upon the present in the United States?
Well, I'm actually, my next film, or one of my next film projects, is titled Ignorance by Design. And it addresses that very point of Americans don't know who we are by design, because our curriculum obviously does not go into depth. They still say the Battle of Wounded Knee, and there's still elements in terms of minimum standards of curriculum that are actually quite pitiful. And it's definitely not our minimum standard of curriculum from a Native perspective. Now, an interesting dynamic with the curriculum, I think, would be if we would finally tell the truth and teach accuracy of who we are as Native people in America, then we would have future generations of understanding. So I think that's starting to happen now. Only one of the 50 states requires Indigenous studies, and that's Montana, a neighbor state to us. So my hope is that all 50 states will have Indigenous studies as a requirement so that our young ones are not being taught by Western movies or cartoons or the product of ignorance by design, because we have multi-generations of instructors, of teachers, of educators that are truly ignorant by design. And so how could they teach the truth when they don't know it? When all they've been told for multi-generations is a lie. So that's a frustration and challenge for our non-Indian brothers and sisters in education, because they don't know how to teach the truth. So, but again, you see now with this generation and the prophecy of the seventh generation from Wounded Knee, you see some of those shifts. Obviously, we're having a racial shift during this time, not only in America, but throughout the world. And part of that is now the quote unquote millennial generation. They seem to be more open-minded and wanting to learn outside of the curriculum and get more of the facts and truth behind history. Hence, you see a lot of the Christopher Columbus holidays being changed to Indigenous Day or American Indian Day or whatever day in terms of the tribe in that particular state. So eventually that will be a holiday of the past, and the mythology will be part of education, because Columbus never set foot in what is now the United States of America. He quote unquote discovered Haiti and the Dominican Republic, as I recall, maybe parts of Cuba. So again, that was another mythology of American history where they want to focus on the myth because it just sounds better in terms of that umbrella of the good part of American history. But unfortunately, there's a resistance to telling that truth, because how many generations of people have been taught the good things about Columbus, and then suddenly we're here saying, oh no, he didn't discover anything. And how do you discover an inhabited land? I've been fortunate to testify before Congress and as a Native advocate and educator. And so one of my testimonies before the Senate of the United States, the committee is, I was the first Oglala Lakota tribal member that was a member of the NFL alumni, our professional football league here in America. So I go, since I'm the first that's ever been in this room, I have therefore discovered you. So I said that to the US senators. Some senators didn't see the humor, some did. So again, utilizing humor so they could self-actualize that, you know what? Yeah, that is ignorant to say that. How could you discover something that's inhabited? So, you know, I didn't get a holiday for discovering them. But I even use that as a joke. I go, you don't have to give me a holiday, you know? So again, I try to use humor so that my non-Indian brothers and sisters can kind of self-actualize that information and personalize it. Otherwise, it's just coming from a foreign perspective. And I think it's more effective for them to kind of equate it to some of their history, similar to the Irish Native history and the American Native history when it came to oppression and some of those challenges.
In your documentary, you make the point of showing that the Lakota Nation were very demoralized, obviously, after the massacre at Wounded Knee. But around this time, a lot of different Christian organizations, different denominations of Christian organizations come into Native people and attempt to proselytize and convert to Christianity. Can you give us a sense of the people after Wounded Knee and how these Christian groups who were coming in, the impact they had on the different nations?
Yeah, again, there's some similarities there when you think of Christianity and impacts of culture. In Ireland, we had similar impacts as well, because once the American Holocaust, I refer to it, the American genocide, was started in 1492 with Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean. And then it obviously grew till 1890, the Massacre of Wounded Knee. So during those 4 centuries was incredible amounts of attempts of genocide and eliminating the indigenous, because in order to colonize, you must eliminate the indigenous. So, and then the indigenous that are left over, you must colonize and make them into somebody else. So there's where religion came in, because the whole issue of the American history and colonization and westward expansion was under the guise of manifest destiny. Was that it was the doctrine of discovery that God says this is what we're supposed to do. Therefore, the annihilation of native people or of other four-legged relatives or whatever, winged relatives that are being wiped out, you know, those were justified through religion. So now, as a result of this mass genocidal effort, now we need to save the Indian, save the native person, the indigenous person. So that's where churches started to infiltrate many of our reservations. So what we now call tribal nations in America, there's over 500 tribal nations in the United States. Those were reservations, which originally were concentration camps. So now we lovingly call it the res, as the gentleman said in our film. But that was a concentration camp, which is now our home. And then the past 100 years was assimilation and cultural genocide, which was the resultant of aspects of the churches and the schools within those churches and some of those Christianized elements of trying to save us as Native people. So I was raised Catholic. I no longer practice Catholicism, but I respect the religions in base, but I'm also very well aware of what religions did to not only our people, but to other tribal native populations throughout the world and in history. So it's a delicate balance, if you will. Both of our cultures are very complicated and layered and multi-tribal, I say. So that's something, but we've all had that experience where Christianity or religion compromised our tribal values and perspectives and then brought in new challenges as a result.
And just following on from that theme, because there's someone who you interview in the documentary, another person in the Lakota Nation, Mr. Virgil Bush, and he talks about the assimilation process with these Christian institutions, boarding schools, etc., that come in. There's the cultural suppression goes on, but also the impact that has on the native language and how that was suppressed. Could we talk about that first? But then further on in the documentary, it's a very inspiring story where we see language revival in the present day with the younger generation and schools and creches that they go to that speak in the Lakota language. Could you tell us a bit about that journey from language suppression to language revival?
Yeah, again, with that challenge of language, that was by design. So, they even have English only just recently in America as a requirement. And then, of course, we as sovereign nations said, no way is it English only. We will obviously utilize English, but we're going to keep our languages alive, regardless of what you want us to do. So that was our stance. But literally, a lot of people, I did not know Lakota. I'm still not a fluent speaker as a result of not growing up on Pine Ridge, or in an Indian community, if you will. So when I speak at home, the elders are polite, but they know that my, English, Southern California urban accent is kind of ruining my Lakota. But I do the best I can because I want my grandchildren to hear the language so they can know that Takoja is grandson, our grandchildren. So those are the type of things with the language where there was a concentrated effort to eliminate our language, so that they knew if they took away our language, then our culture would slowly fade away. Now, when you think of the Europeans that voluntarily left Europe and came to America, generally it was the second generation that their language was gone. So it's usually a 2-generation process when you emigrate or immigrate, whatever, to where the 2 generations ahead will start Americanizing in this example. So now we have a lot of Native people that don't know who they are because of that concentrated effort. And that's something that's been a challenge for us historically. And Leonard Littlefinger, one of our elders that we interviewed, unfortunately has made his journey, but he left wonderful footprints for future generations with his language school, with his teachings, not only with the language, but of the culture. So he's one of my mentors as an elder in training, I like to call myself, but that's something where learning is lifelong. And to earn that title of elder is a process to where you earn it by learn it by storytelling and maintaining the language. So Leonard, leaving his footprints before his ultimate journey, was language preservation. And he left many footprints, but that's one of his strongest, deepest prints for future generations, is how many of those kids that are speaking Lakota today because of his efforts will teach future generations, 7 generations ahead. So wouldn't it be wonderful to wear Lakota as an exploding language back home again in the next few generations? I might not see it my time on this earth, but my grandchildren may see it. And wouldn't that be a wonderful experience for them?
Jim, if we could talk about in terms of cultural revival, in generally speaking, among Native nations in the United States, at the tail end of the 1960s, you have the American Indian movement, AIM, and which was run in some ways parallel with other civil rights movements in the United States and elsewhere at that period of time. You had the very famous occupation of Alcatraz Island. You had occupations in Seattle, but you also had an occupation in Wounded Knee in 1973, which led to more confrontation between the United States, the FBI, things like that. But in that general time period, did you see cultural revival among younger generations of Native Americans, Lakota people, and otherwise?
Yeah, and here's something where learning what I know, and again, I'm a novice with Irish history, but I love to learn about Indigenous history no matter where it is. So again, in the 60s was obviously, there was some things going on in Ireland similar to what AIM was doing, American Indian Movement, getting started in the late 60s and really getting active in the early 70s. One of the biggest challenges that we have is being homogenized as a culture, because there's still 200 languages today. I speak Lakota. My wife is Hoopa, so I live in Kumeyaay country. So that's something where those are 3 distinct languages. So many people will go, do you speak Indian? And I go, I don't know, do you speak European? So that's another self-actualized approach that I want people to learn when they say these things. They're not doing it to be mean or hurtful necessarily. They're just ignorant by design by saying those type of things. And my job as an elder in training and as an advocate, as an educator, is to try to do my best to help my non-Indian brothers and sisters know the truth. Now, I know there's going to be a population of people, and it's an unfortunate reality where we are as two-leggeds as a species, that the racism is still prevalent today in 2021. And I see January 6th as a kind of a last stand of white supremacy in America. They showed who they are. They showed what they wanted to do. So that was a horrible experience in history, but it was something needed to show a light on what's happening in a segment of our country that is now trying to divide us as two-leggeds versus bring us together. Many people call it melting pot. I don't like that term because we just melt into soup. I love a tapestry example. When you have a multitude of different cultures together, working together, forming something strong together, instead of, unfortunately, historically, this is what we're doing. And that's the frustration as an elder, as a grandfather now. I was a warrior, if you will, in my youth, but I'm a different kind of warrior in my elder years. And those warrior societies that we have in Indian country and our native populations here, there's some of the warrior societies in history in Ireland as well. So that's why I feel a connection with Ireland. And I'm so glad my son's mother has Irish roots. So one of our father-son trips when he was 16 is we went to Ireland, and we went to Burrtown where his grandfather, John Patrick Clear, emigrated to the United States. And then he ended up being the horse wrangler in the Civil War for General Grant. So my son's Irish grandfather, many grandfathers ago, crossed paths with General Grant. Then a few years later, on his Lakota side, Grandfather Stabber was with Red Cloud and other Lakota leaders at the White House negotiating peace with President Grant. So what a wonderful connection, again, for him as an individual that sees the world with a Lakota lens, but I wanted him to know his Irish and Euro side as well, so that he could see the wonderful connections that can be versus what is happening out there generally.
Thanks, Jim. And I suppose this leads me on to my last question, and it's in relation to the Seventh Generation Project. Now, I've watched the documentary a couple of times and done my research into it, and you can see what you're talking about here about the, the sense of togetherness rather than promoting any idea of conflict. It's a very inspiring story. Could you tell us a bit about the Seventh Generation Project?
Well, I call it the project because it's kind of my life mission in terms of my responsibility as a Lakota, but also as a filmmaker, as an advocate, as an educator. I wear many hats, so I have an opportunity to share the message, if you will, and represent the ancestors in a good way. So the footprints that I'm leaving now, I'm doing my best to share our perspectives, our culture, and improve our status in society as best I can in my small way. But collectively, when you think of the seventh generation, it's not only us as Lakota, it's all of us as two-leggeds. It's all of us as human beings. So that's the inclusive nature of our culture, which actually cost us dearly when we were inclusive and saw the newcomers as human beings and we were not seen as human beings. So obviously the outcome was obvious in terms of that philosophy. But today, as evolved human beings, we're still evolving, obviously, because we have many challenges as two-leggeds. But what the future generations, obviously, all of us as human beings, is we want a better world for our grandchildren. We want a better world for our future family members. So that's something as human beings, we share that value collectively. So what can we do to get back to our tribal roots, if you will, versus our colonized roots or our empire roots, or, all those different aspects where people are separated by levels. From a tribal philosophy, again, it's everyone's part of that circle. Yeah. And it's, it's an equality, if you will. The mythology of the Round Table, the Knights of the Round Table, is tribal from my perspective in terms of equality. Even though there's a leader, everyone had a voice and a position at the table or in the circle or at the 7 council fires that we have.
Thank you, Jim. I'd just like to say thanks again for taking the time to speak to me today. As I mentioned, Seventh Generation, it's a very inspiring documentary, going from tragedy and turning things into something really positive. Hopefully at some point we can get it to Irish audiences. But for now, Jim, thanks very much for joining me today. I really appreciate you giving up the time to speak to me.
Yeah, it's my honor as well. Again, my experience in Ireland and the Hill of Tara and learning some of those tribal elements of Ireland. As we say over here, keep up the good fight, because keep your language, keep your culture, and then all of us as human beings must find a way to respect those differences and move forward together, even with those different languages and culture. So that's hopefully where we go in terms of the next 7 generations. For all of us as human beings, that will be a wonderful outcome. So Palamia Washtelo. Thank you so much for having me.